Okay, welcome. So let's begin. I see people are still coming into the Zoom and the social media platforms, but we will do the un-Israeli thing and start on time today. All right, and and I'm not going to use this joke anymore because I've been using it too much, I've been told. All right, so welcome everyone, wherever you are. It's a good evening if you're in Israel, good morning, and good afternoon if you're in the United States or elsewhere in the world. I'm Dr. Yoav Fromer. I'm the head of the Center for the Study of the United States in partnership with the Fulbright program at Tel Aviv University. It gives me great pleasure to welcome everyone to this, our second webinar in a three-part series dedicated to exploring the next generation of U.S. Israel relations, with an emphasis on how younger Americans and Israelis think about and relate to one another. This is a collaboration with our friends at the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA and the Kasdan Institute at USC. I want to take the opportunity also to acknowledge my collaborators on this venture, Professors Dov Waxman and David Myers at UCLA, and Professor Steve Ross and Lisa Ansel at USC. Thanks also, as always, to the center's staff, especially Hadar Dryman, Ora Sher, and our wonderful IT staff at Tau for all their help in organizing this. Today we will focus on one group in particular inside the United States that has become in recent decades the most consistent and arguably influential in its unequivocal and passionate support for Israel. And that is, of course, the Christian evangelical community. In the summer of 1981, after Israel bombed Iraq's nuclear plant at Osirak, the first phone call that the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin reportedly made was not to President Reagan or any of his cabinet officials, but rather to the Reverend Jerry Falwell, the head of the Moral Majority, to request that he help Israel in explaining its position to the American public. This was no coincidence. Since the 1980s, evangelicals, who had become a leading constituency inside the GOP a few years earlier, aided Israel whenever and as much as they could. And whether it was in resisting calls to halt Israeli settlement expansion, which was something many consecutive American presidents, both Republican and Democrats, demanded, whether it's opposition to selling advanced American military equipment to Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, or whether it was just a call to expand American financial and military aid to Israel, the evangelical community had always been there. And arguably it had been the most influential voice in the so-called pro-Israel lobby. To such an extent, I think, that the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, suggested in a quite controversial manner in 2021 that Israel should prioritize the, quote, passionate and unequivocal support of evangelical Christians over that of American Jews. But is this still the case today? And more importantly, will it still be the case in 10, 20 years that Israel can and will and should count on the evangelical support, especially of younger generations? Is that still going to be the case in a few years? And that really is the question that we're going to try to deal with today. So I want to very briefly introduce our wonderful, stellar panel of scholars who will try to answer this question and evaluate what is the future of the evangelical relationship with the evangelical relationship inside the United States with Israel, especially the next generation. So I'll briefly introduce our panelists alphabetically. Dr. Kirill Bumin, he's an associate dean of the Metropolitan College at Boston University and the director of its summer term. He specializes in ethnic conflict, comparative judicial politics, and survey research on American public attitudes related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He is co-author with Moti Bari of Christian Zionism in the 21st Century, American Evangelical Opinion on Israel, that was just released last month with Oxford University Press. Our second panelist, Dr. Daniel Hummel, is a historian of American religion. He serves as the director of the Lumen Center in Madison, Wisconsin. He's also a research fellow in the history department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the author of several books, most recently, The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism, How the Evangelical Battle Over the End Times Shaped the Nation. And before that, he authored Covenant Brothers, Evangelicals, Jews, and U.S. Israeli Relations. Our third panelist is Professor Moti Bari. He's a professor of religion at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. His research focuses on Jewish history, thought, culture, with expertise in Jewish politics, Ethics, Gender, and Sexuality. In addition to co-authoring Christian Zionism in the 21st Century, he has published several other books, including Ruth Blau, A Life of Paradox and Purpose. It just came out last year, and I just started reading that. And The Making of Modern Jewish Identity, Ideological Change, and Religious Conversion. Our final panelist, Professor Diane Winston, is a professor at the Annenberg School of Journalism and Communication at the University of Southern California. She's also the Knight Center Chair in Media and Religion, a Pulitzer Prize nominated journalist, author, and columnist. She has authored and edited numerous books on the connection between religion, media, history, and politics in America. They include, among a very long list of books, Faith in the Market, Religion and the Rise of Urban Commercial Culture, Religion and Reality TV, Faith in Late Capitalism, and her latest book, Writing the American Dream, How the Media Mainstreamed Reagan's Evangelical Vision. So before we start, and we're just going to get right into this very timely topic, I just want to notify, if you have questions, and we've already started receiving questions via email to the Center for the U.S. Studies at Tel Aviv University's website, you can just, through the Zoom, you have the option of Q&A, right? So you can just send your questions there. We'll do our best to answer. We have a few hundred people in the audience already, so we'll do our best to answer, and I'll condense some of these questions. All right. So I want to start with Moti and Kira. First, congratulations on your new book, and given your profound research, that really, I think in the past 5-6 years, this is all you've done, the field research about evangelical attitudes. Can you please lay out for us your major findings? What are the attitudes of younger evangelicals in the U.S. toward Israel, and how have they changed?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us today. It's really a pleasure to share some of our findings with you. Our research began in 2018 with a nationally representative survey of evangelical and born-again Christians. And in that survey, even after controlling for political explanations for support for Israel, religious ones, sociological, cultural, and so on, we found this really interesting effect, and that is younger evangelicals, that is folks under 30 years old, 18 to 29-year-olds, were fundamentally different in terms of their support for Israel than the older generations. In particular, they were less supportive, even after controlling for all these other types of explanations possible. And so in 2021, we decided to delve deeper into this subpopulation to really understand how they justify their positions on the Israeli-Palestinian dispute and what sorts of arguments they bring to bear on the question of support for Israel. And so we focused on 18 to 29-year-old self-identified evangelical and born-again Christians. And we asked them a whole host of standard survey questions, as well as open-end questions, which really allow them to speak with their own voice, with their own language, to help us understand how they feel about the dispute. What we observed in 2018 was that young evangelicals were not particularly secular. They were just as religious, roughly, as the older generations. But as you can see here, from 2018 to 2021, even taking into account the margin of error and the differences in the samples, there was a change. We see that they have become less religious in terms of their church attendance, as well as in terms of their Bible readership. In addition to that, we saw a decline in what we found to be a fundamental set of beliefs related to support for Israel, and that is belief in the Abrahamic covenant, which essentially asserts that there is a special, ongoing, eternal relationship between God and the Jewish people that comes with promises of land to Jews, and that Gentiles, if they are to support and embrace this Abrahamic covenant, will receive blessings in return. You could see that the numbers are still quite high. A strong majority of 2021 young evangelicals still support Abrahamic covenant, but there is a decline, and more of them are expressing uncertainty. Look at the don't know category. We also found that young evangelicals in 2021 were less likely to socialize with other pro-Israel evangelicals. They were less frequently exposed to pro-Israel messages, such as hearing the importance of supporting Israel within the context of Christian faith and Christian practices, as well as their understanding of end times. In addition, we saw a really dramatic shift in attitudes towards Muslims. Opinion of Muslims is a statistically significant predictor of support for Israel, inversely speaking. So those that have a very positive attitude towards Muslims tend to have lower levels of support for Israel. And what we see here is that in 2018, young evangelicals had a relatively negative or neutral impression of Muslims, whereas in 2021, that opinion improved quite significantly, and there's greater level of warmth toward Muslims in general. Ideologically, we also see a shift from a relatively robust conservative position to a more moderate or centrist position among young evangelicals. And we also discovered that evangelicals, when they sort of consider their own religious beliefs, told us that roughly half of them, 44.4%, did not think that their religious beliefs were in any way directly tied to their attitudes towards the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. Only 38% of them said that the religious beliefs made them more supportive of Israel, whereas the other 17% felt that way about the Palestinians. Now I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleague Moti, and he'll talk more explicitly and directly about Israeli-Palestinian dispute.
Yes, so what you see in the chart right now is a question that we asked, which it goes like this. In relation to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, where do you place your support? And what you see 3 bars. The first one is the under 30 evangelicals in the survey in 2018, and the second one is above 30 and above in the survey in 2018, and then the under 30 in 2021. So in the first survey, we already saw that the younger evangelicals are less supportive of Israel than the other age cohorts. It was 76 among the 30 and above, and 69 in the 30 and below. But in 2021, the numbers dropped to 33%. So this is a really strong drop. And as you can see, the black bar of the 2021 shows you that what we see is kind of like a very like of a normal shape of support, which is most of the young evangelicals are like entering into the middle, the support neither, and the rest is distributed kind of evenly, where is a little bit slight more support toward Israel than the Palestinians, but it's kind of like even distribution. So there was a strong drop in the 3 years difference between the 2 surveys. Now, in our follow-up question, we asked the participants to type down an answer. Why did they choose Palestinians or Israelis or neither? And then they typed an answer, and then we divided it into subgroups. And those who said that they support Israel over the Palestinians. So as you can see from the charts, maybe it's a little bit small, but about 60% of them use religious reasons that typically are related to the Abrahamic covenant. And they support Israel because Israel is God's chosen people, or Israel is the land of God. About 20% used political reasons, that the land belongs to Israel. And, you know, sometimes the line between what is religious and what is political is not that clear. And we try to divide it up according to the responses. But you can see that the main argument that those pro-Israel evangelical, young evangelicals, the main argument that they've used was related to some ways to the Abrahamic covenant and to biblical reasoning. Those who said that they support neither, which was the largest group of all groups, 71% of them said they just don't know enough to make an opinion. And so this is the main argument behind it. They just don't know. This is why they choose to neutrality. And the third group was actually very interesting to see the response, and it tells something very interesting about this young generation. So those who said that they support the Palestinians, about half of them used like typical social justice reasons, like the Palestinians are the victims of Israeli maltreatment. But then almost a second half, 40%, said it's a very common response. I just don't know. Why did you pick the Palestinians over the Israelis? I just don't know. We called it gut feeling of favorability. What it means is that they know it in their gut. They have like a general sense that they need to support the Palestinians. This is maybe the right thing to say, but they really have no knowledge why they need to support the Palestinians. It's just a gut feeling. So another open-end question that we asked them was, previous studies have shown that younger evangelicals sometimes express lower support for Israel than older evangelicals. Why might this be the case in your opinion? And again, we got 700 responses, very diverse answers. And so about 1/3 of them said they don't know. But those who gave an answer, it was typically divided between two different responses. As you can see, the largest bar, 34%, says it's about generational differences, meaning young people and old people are just different people. They have different opinions, they have different views, they read the Bible differently, they have different political points of view. So this is the main response that they have given us. They are just different people. And the second largest was that young people are less knowledgeable about Israel than the older folks. So these are the two main answers that we received from the participants. So if we want to kind of sum it up, generational differences exist because of different informational environments and experiences. Different generations saw Israel in different contexts and informational environments, and thus developed different attitudes. So the older guys and the younger people have just lived through different times and have witnessed Israel in different situations and developed different points of view. The current crop of under 30 Americans grew up with more diverse source of information that are generally more critical of Israel and more likely to generate strong emotional response because it's more visual. Once opinions are formed, they are hard to change. If these opinions are strongly held, new and contrasting information is judged against pre-existing beliefs and interpreted accordingly. Under 30 evangelicals are also more exposed than older generations to religious traditions that assign little theological importance to contemporary Jewish people in Israel. What we discovered in our research, that 68% of young evangelicals adhere to post-millennial and amillennial eschatological views. We didn't say any word about that, but the older guys, the older generations tend to be more premillennial, and the youngers are not following this tradition or do not look at their eschatology from that perspective, and it makes a big difference in their attitudes toward Israel.
So, all right, great. All right, so thanks Moti and Kirill for kind of the general introduction here. Just a few points that I want to emphasize because we went through a lot of data here, and it's important. First of all, I hope you noticed, right? So all of this data is between 2018 and spring 2021, right? And
Yes.
That's important. So maybe later on we can speculate on what the situation is today. But before that, so we saw that in these 3-4 years that were covered, right? You see a drop of more than half of the support for Israel, which is, I think, very dramatic. But even more dramatic, and for me, I saw that the support for the Palestinians, which was barely anything, was around 5%, that quadruples. I think that is very significant within a 3-4 year period. And finally, this idea of neutrality is also an immensely important factor, right? That 42% are saying, well, we're neither here nor there. and it's everyone is moving towards the center in a way, and not taking a particular ideological point here. So that's really interesting, and I want to try to unpack this with Diane and Daniel. What I would like to hear from your perspectives, what might be causing kind of this transformation? What root causes do you identify, especially in your own field of expertise, that might help us better understand really the underlying forces driving this quite transformative events? Diane, please, would you like to begin? You're on mute.
Thank you. I think there are 5 main causes that I would look to. The first is social media. Almost a majority of young people get their news from social media. And oftentimes it's from sites like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. These sites all have been heavily colonized by Palestinian influencers who have posted and have received many more hashtags than pro-Israeli posters. And this is true since the start of the Gaza war. Now, interestingly enough, although more eyeballs are looking at the Palestinian posts, people are spending more time with the Israeli posts. So it's difficult to say how that influence is shaping people, though there's been a lot of response online to what are allegedly seen as IDF videos, which seem as if soldiers are enjoying the occupation and destruction of Gaza. Tied to the social media environment is the fact that young evangelicals have much more in common with their secular cohort. In other words, not only can they meet on social media, but many evangelicals who are at non-Christian colleges are in an environment where their peers may be more pro-Palestinian than possibly at a Christian college. This peer pressure is very important because it has opened evangelicals up to the Palestinian side of what's going on in Gaza, for example. Now, peer pressure is important, but also it's important to note that young evangelicals have moved away from the partisan politics of their elders and have embraced a very different worldview. Instead of having the same concepts of end times premillennialist theology and having that as at the center of many beliefs, young evangelicals are more interested in social justice. Reverend Samuel Rodriguez, who's who's president of the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference, said, and I think this is quite good, we're moving from a Billy Graham generation to a Martin Luther King generation. And you can see this in evangelical attitudes towards immigration reform, to Black Lives Matter, to same-sex marriage, and to structural injustice. Also, many young evangelicals were horrified by the election of Trump, and that has pushed them further into what we might consider the moderate to progressive camp. So social media, peer pressure, changing theology, move away from partisan politics, and the times we live in have all contributed to this shift that we've been hearing about in young evangelicals' attitudes towards Israel. I would also say that some of my sources told me that for whatever reasons, the older Christian Zionist generation did not do a good job of theological formation of younger people. And many millennials in particular began pushing back against the Christian Zionist idea. And as a result, Gen Z is much more open to seeing Israel as just another nation among nations, instead of the place where God has rested so many hopes for the future.
Great, Dan. Daniel, do you want to pick that up from your perspective and try to kind of see why and explain why some of these transformations are taking place?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you. And I think as a historian, I will maybe do a little whiplash for us and pull us back out of the 2020s just for a few minutes. First of all, just reading this book, I was struck by this is a tradition to try to understand why evangelicals support Israel. And it goes all the way back to at least the 1950s. And I think this is an amazing book. It's so, as someone who studies religion, it uses categories as a religious historian that I really resonate with and can and appreciate, particularly because I know the literature. I think all the way back, some of these early studies were about actually trying to understand the Christians that were in early Israel, early statehood Israel. So I'm thinking of like Chaim Vardi, who was a minister in the Ministry of Religious Affairs, who wrote a book in 1950 called Christians in Israel, trying to decode some of this stuff, particularly around the Baptists and others who were missionaries in Israel. I think of Per Osterby, who was a missionary who wrote The Church in Israel in 1970 and cataloged something like 40 different sects that were existing in Israel, and then their connections to their home countries. And then maybe the one that some of us who study this are more familiar with is Yonah Malachi's 1978 American Fundamentalists and Israel. And he actually took a tour of seminaries and other places in the U.S. So this book stands in that distinguished tradition of trying to understand what is going on in the U.S. And American Christianity that would promote such rabid support for Israel. So I want to give just three sort of historical angles on this. One is, maybe it's a bit controversial, but I wonder if what we're witnessing in this polling data is actually a reversion to pre-1967 status of views on Israel within the evangelical world. And I basically have two reasons why I'd say that. The first is there were a lot of unique conditions in the 1960s through the 1980s that produced the modern Christian Zionist movement as we have come to sort of assume it in the last few decades. And we know this even from the actors. So if you take someone like Jerry Falwell, in 1984, he had a quote that he gave to a journalist, and he said, "Over the last 20 years, fundamentalists and evangelicals at a very rapid pace have been so-called converting to support for Israel." So even Falwell, who was in the 80s, was saying, this is about a 20-year-old movement where there's a lot of strong energy around supporting Israel. We know that the effects of the 1967-1973 wars on the evangelical community were ones that really promoted a positive view of Israel, a view of Israel that affirmed these theological convictions that are documented in the book around the covenanted role, the covenanted relationship of Jews to the land and the prophetic significance of what was going on during these wars. And there's a whole generation of evangelicals who had those as formative memories of Israel. The 1970s are also when there was a lot of concern around anti-Semitism, around remembering the Holocaust and processing that in American culture, and a desire for Jewish-Christian cooperation. And evangelicals, in their own way, participate in that. And there's a generation of evangelicals, particularly that are becoming politicized, who are very invested in the Judeo-Christian concept. And they see Israel and the U.S. as key symbols of the Judeo-Christian civilization. And then there's also just shifting theological priorities in evangelicalism that meant that Israel became integrated into evangelical politics in the 70s and 80s in a very prominent way. There's the popularization of dispensational theology through the Late Great Planet Earth and Tim LaHaye books and a very just big cottage industry. There is the Cold War foreign policy framework that and the so-called New Cold War in the early 80s that evangelicals were very involved in framing that ideological contest that had Israel and the U.S. on the side of freedom against the communist world. And then even within the evangelical world, the saliency of eschatology as a sort of dividing line within the community was something that had been around for a few decades. It was not always that way, and it's not always been that way, that different views on eschatology are what sort of shape Christian communities. But in the mid-20th century, for a variety of reasons, that was one of the main dividing lines. And so premillennialism, and particularly dispensational premillennialism, were very salient in the culture in the 70s and 80s. And I would argue today they're not so much. I mean, the polling shows it's not so much for young evangelicals, but even for middle-aged evangelicals, people who have been in the movement for a while, this is not the burning issue that it was 30 or 40 years ago. I also think there are, and this is all still me trying to see if this is an exception. This like last few generations that were very pro-Israel. I think there are enduring attitudes built into conservative Protestantism that are always going to push against close identification. One is the role of missions in evangelicalism, missions both to the Jewish people, which is something that Christian Zionists have had to navigate ever since the 19th century, at least, and probably before, and also missions to the Arab world that are contingent, at least seen by some evangelicals, on the way evangelicals relate to Israel. So if evangelicals are seen as pro-Israel, that makes it harder to be successful evangelists in the Arab world. There's also, outside of dispensationalism and some strands of Pentecostalism, there's not a lot of strong theological traditions that see Israel as a nation set apart. You could say in one term, the supersessionist tradition is quite strong, even in Protestantism, even if in recent generations in the U.S. that has not been the dominant theology. For many traditions, including Lutheranism and Presbyterianism and others, that has been the traditional view. And so outside of dispensationalists and Pentecostals, there isn't the same amount of theological framework to think about Israel as a nation set apart. And then, of course, there are many significant political differences between evangelicals and Jews, either in the U.S. or in Israel, outside of shared support for Israel, that have always pushed up against the relationship as well on a lot of domestic issues and even other foreign policy issues. Okay, so that's maybe my first thing. The other two are shorter. The second point I wanted to make is that we now have a 40-year-old maturing organizational and media infrastructure that is supporting Christian Zionism. And I think this might actually make the movement a little less impervious to shifts in younger generations, at least for a little while. And what I mean by that is there are a number of organizations now like International Christian Embassy, Bridges for Peace, Christians United for Israel, who have now been around for a while, and they create stability to a relationship that for much of the 20th century did not have stable organizations at the center of it. And so there are deep connections between Israeli policymakers and these leaders of these organizations. There's also a full media infrastructure that promotes a positive view of Israel and even a Christian Zionist view of Israel. You can think of the Christian Broadcast Network, the Glenn Beck network of media, Daystar, even Fox News. They have a consistent stream of content and reporting that's supportive of Israel. This did not exist in the 60s or 70s. This was a development in the late 20th century. So these are maybe factors that point to some stability in the relationship, even if there is less passion at the bottom. However, that will only go so far, and that will only last so long. As more passionate Christian Zionists age out, that will ultimately affect these institutions, but in a way that might mean there's a slower process in at least the visibility of the decline in evangelical support, even if the polling is showing that the support has dropped significantly or is dropping significantly on a generational line. And go ahead.
No, so I think Diane wanted to jump in here with something, right. And also, and exactly, I think maybe it's this point about, you mentioned the Christian Broadcasting Network and these traditional media infrastructures, but I haven't looked at data, but I would imagine that most of the viewers of something like CBN, right, they tend to be disproportionately alongside the viewers of Fox News who are older, right, and certainly, and this might help explain some of these bridges, problems that we're seeing. Yeah, Diane, please.
Putting on my hat as a historian of American evangelicalism, I would say that support for Christian Zionism is not a new, and I'm speaking of 20th century phenomenon. It actually dates back to the 19th century. And as you well know, the publication, John Darby's publication of his premillennialist ideas had a great influence on Christians from the early 19th century on, culminating in the British Zionist support for a Jewish homeland at the end of the 19th century. In fact, I was watching Daniel Deronda recently, which is George Eliot's 1876 novel, which actually talks about Jewish homelands and empowering young British Jews to go there to begin settling Palestine. So I think this history and the strength of premillennialism goes from the late 19th century up through the 60s and 70s, and Falwell picked up on that And it was one of his consistent themes throughout his preaching, which actually began in the early 60s rather than the 70s. Though I think you're correct in stating that Reagan and his election facilitated a more widespread understanding of Christian Zionism. I also think that if you look back to the early 20th century, it's notable to me that the signers of the Balfour Declaration had such a great impact as the Treaty of Versailles was being negotiated. And a group of Americans were sent out to the Middle East to see how the idea of a Jewish homeland would have been accepted at this period. And they came back and reported to the peacemakers that it was a terrible idea because the Arab nations would not tolerate a Jewish homeland. But because there was still so much support for Balfour Declaration during these negotiations after World War I, the idea for a Jewish homeland was instituted. So the conflict was not born in 67 or 48 or 73. I think it stretches back much longer. And I think Christian support for Israel is not something that just appeared in the mid to late 20th century, but has been a lasting phenomena for more than 100 years.
So we'll just come back to that. I want to talk about something that we've been repeating, and I think going back to the data, Moti and Kirill, I want to ask it something that I think we take for granted. Who do we talk about when we talk about evangelicals? And I think we have to ask that question because for many, at least certainly in Israel, but I think also if a lot of Americans, we have a certain mythologized image, right? We're thinking about Falwell or Billy Graham. We're thinking about some kind of stereotypical middle-class white, right? Probably in the South or Midwest, suburban, or maybe rural, right? And that's what we're thinking about. But the evangelical community in America today is not like that anymore. And that's part of the story here, right? So both Moti and Kirill, I'm wondering if you can help us kind of through the data and through your own kind of research, if you could maybe talk to us about the changing demographics and specifically, if we're thinking about the fastest growing groups within the evangelical community, of course, we're thinking about Hispanics. And then the question is, do white and non-white young evangelicals have different attitudes toward Israel, right? And do we even know the proportion within the evangelical community of these, of racial and ethnic identity? And if this is the case, then can we identify a primary variable in defining their support for Israel? Would it be religion, or would it be race or ethnicity? Because if it is race and ethnicity, we know from other studies that both Hispanics and African Americans they have a much lower rate of supporting Israel. So what happens if more and more of them are becoming evangelicals? So that just, if you can try to organize the whole demographic transformation, I think that'd be very helpful for us.
Okay, so I'll start, or Kirill, you want to start?
Moti, go ahead. I'll follow up.
Okay, yes. So we typically, when we are thinking of a stereotypical evangelical, we're typically thinking of a white man. And when the media, when they are speaking about evangelicals, sometimes they add the white, sometimes they drop the white, sometimes it's automatic. It's assumed that all evangelicals are white. It's kind of pre-assumed. But our studies showed us very clearly that this is not the case. Whites dominate the evangelical community. In our studies, it's about 60 to 65% of evangelicals are white. The second largest is African American. I guess nobody thinks of evangelicals as African Americans. And the smallest group, but is the fastest growing, as you have mentioned, is the Hispanics. When you look at the demographics of young evangelicals, the numbers are changing even more, that 50% are white, and I think about 20 to 30% are African Americans, Hispanic, and there's also a mixed race, a growing number of those who are multiple races. And so this is the demographical outlook of evangelicals, very different from what typically the media portrayed them. And now when it comes to how do different evangelicals from different races think about Israel, we have conducted multiple studies, and we realized that with one exception, but typically there is no difference between a white evangelical and African-American evangelical, Hispanic evangelicals in the way they perceive Israel.
So religion is a defining factor here, right? Because if you remove the religious identity, then we see that Hispanics and African Americans traditionally, and this has been consistently in the data, are less supportive of Israel and also have higher rates of anti-Semitism, unfortunately.
If you don't mind, let me jump in. This is, I think, probably the biggest strength of our book, and that is we bring statistical analysis, which allows to isolate unique or independent effects of multiple variables at once. And so that's one of the things that we're able to do to avoid spurious correlations, right? So if you simply observe that African Americans are less supportive of Israel than white non-Hispanics, you may conclude that that has to do with the race. But once we take into account other religious, political, social characteristics, by and large, as Moti said, we found that race is not a significant predictor. The exception to that is actually our Young Evangelical survey, where we did find that African Americans, even after controlling for a number of these other variables, that ethnicity still proves to be a statistically significant predictor. And we found that it provides for lower support of Israel. But I would say that in and of itself, race or ethnicity is less consequential, not only for the evangelicals, but for the other groups like the Catholics that we've looked at, than religious or political determinants of support. I also want to kind of add to what Moti has already said regarding young evangelicals. So we see that the minority groups are growing vis-a-vis the white, non-Hispanic evangelicals. They also tend to oftentimes identify with born-again label rather than the evangelical label because of the political baggage that oftentimes comes with that label. And an additional thing that I want to mention is we see that these younger folks are distinctive on the eschatological and theological grounds from the older evangelicals, which also accounts for why Israel is becoming less consequential to them. I believe Diane noticed that, mentioned that young evangelicals just don't see Israel in the same light as the older evangelicals. Maybe it was Daniel that said that.
Kirill, could you clarify that point? Because we've been talking a lot about eschatology here, and I think the general audience, I'm not sure everyone is able to distinguish. Can you say why that difference between moving from a premillennialist setting where Israel plays a really important role to a post-millennial or amillennial, right? And why that matters for how they view Israel? Can you just briefly explain that?
Sure. So premillennialism, and particularly its dispensationalist variety, stipulates very specific steps that must occur before the end times and for the coming of Jesus Christ. And so there's a very kind of explicit set of things that have to happen, one of which is that Christ has to come to earth and rule in Jerusalem for roughly a millennium, hence the term millennialism. And so this is the tradition that has an explicit position for the Jewish people and for Israel in Christians' vision of the end times. The other traditions either see that the covenant has been fulfilled in Christ, or they see that Jews are now punished because they crucified Jesus Christ. This is a so-called supersessionist attitude or replacement theology attitude. And so in those amillennial and postmillennial traditions, it's simply not important to consider the role of the contemporary Jews or contemporary Israel for the coming of end times. And so even though young evangelicals probably don't even know the term amillennialism or postmillennialism, the types of things that they hear in church become internalized, right? So we talked a little bit about this gut favorability thing, right? This notion that you have a kind of a natural subconscious reaction to stimuli, right? To information stimuli. That's, I think, what is happening here is that oftentimes young evangelicals that sort of grow up in these less pro-Israel traditions, they naturally gravitate to particular positions that they identify with the scripture and with the sermons that they have heard in their church.
Daniel, you want to respond, and then Diane, please?
Diane had her hand up first. She can go.
Uh-oh. Is that age before beauty? I very much appreciated the work that Kirill and Moti have done. And I have not done surveys. I just have more anecdotal information from speaking to sources. My sense, though, is there is a difference between white evangelicals and communities of color evangelicals insofar as their theological orientation to Israel. And I think many, especially Black evangelicals, both feel the idea that if you bless Israel, God will bless you. If you curse Israel, God will curse you, as well as the attachment to the Exodus narrative, which is different from the end time scenario that many older white evangelicals hold. And I mention that because I think those communities of color are more influenced by the social justice aspect of the Bible than they are of the theological one. And in talking to people, I have the sense that the Black Lives Matter movement, immigration, the treatment of children at the border, George Floyd's killing, all these recent events have helped to move evangelicals of color towards a concern for suffering and injustice. And insofar as they see Israel as a perpetrator of injustice, they side with Palestinians. And I think those communities of color are moving to that idea relatively quickly these days. And one evidence of that is the letter which was signed last week by 1,000 Black pastors calling for a ceasefire. And many of those pastors were evangelical. So I think the idea of social justice and Israel falling on the wrong side of the social justice scale has a lot to do with motivating evangelicals. And although white young evangelicals also care about this and have been informed by all these recent events, I think evangelicals of color are in the vanguard of that.
Daniel, you wanted to respond, and then Moti, I see you also want to respond.
Yeah, just a couple of reflections on the eschatology part, and I think actually that last example of the African American community helps make the point. There is not a necessary political link between premillennialism and support for Israel. There has been a constructed link over time, but there have been plenty of premillennialists who have not been Christian Zionists. There have even been plenty of dispensationalists. Diane mentioned John Nelson Darby, the founder of the Exclusive Brethren. He wrote a lot about a future national Israel. He did not support the Zionist movement of his day. He thought it did not comport to what he expected the prophetic movement to be. And that was actually a strong tradition within the fundamentalist world until 1948, when a lot of those debates got settled really quickly because people agreed this was prophetically significant. And there's some famous examples of fundamentalists who before 1948 were saying that the Zionist movement was not prophetically significant, and then right after 1948 declaring it was. That's one reason why I date this to sometime during the 67 period, when we start seeing an organized, broad-scale movement of evangelicals that, we don't have a ton of polling before that time either to know exactly what evangelicals thought on a political front. But in terms of a political movement, that's what we see. We definitely see Christians before that time, including people like Martin Luther King Jr., who were supportive of Israel. And in fact, most of the support before 1967 was in the mainline and the liberal Protestant traditions, and they had other theological and ethical reasons why they were supporting. But there was no there's been obviously a lot of premillennialism in American history. Most of it has not translated into measurable political support for Israel until the last 50 or so years. You have definite individual standouts, someone like William Blackstone in the late 19th century, very important, but he's almost notable because he was so prominent among a broader group that wasn't organized that way. So I think even with African Americans today, many African American evangelicals are premillennialist. They have that tradition. That's just a theological belief that's been passed down. That does not necessarily mean that they read the Middle East situation in the same way that white evangelicals with the same theological perspectives would. There's so many other factors that would feed into why they land on a certain view on Israel.
Moti, yeah?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Diane's comment, just numbers. Yeah, so out of 700 young evangelicals, we asked them to explain why they support Israel. Out of 700, only one mentioned the second coming. Only one out of 700. So this is really plays nothing for them. Really plays nothing for them, and only 4 out of 700 mentioned that they will be blessed if they support Israel. Only 4. So those things don't play so much of a role for the young generation. What does is so Israel entitled for that land because God promised it to them. This is what's now the argument, the theological argument among the evangelicals.
Kirill, yeah, you wanted to add?
Yeah, a caveat. What Moti said is completely correct. There is this subconscious connection, I think, to eschatology that still matters. But let me get back to something that Diane mentioned twice now, and that's social justice. So, and give you all a little bit of a preview of the second book that we're working on. So we've conducted, subsequently to these surveys, we conducted a set of surveys with within the evangelical and born-again community, specifically asking about these social justice issues. We asked about evangelical support for boycott, divest, and sanction movement. We asked how concerned they were about global warming, how concerned they were about anti-Semitism, how concerned they were about economic inequality and wealth differentials in the U.S., and how concerned they were about racial injustice in the U.S. And one fascinating thing that we observed beyond kind of the common knowledge, which was minority groups are more likely to weigh heavily on the social justice ethos. But what we observed beyond that was that when we did principal factor analysis, a statistical analysis to try to tease out the common aspect of all of these different attitudes, what we found is that racial justice concerns, global warming concerns, economic inequality concerns, support for boycott, divest, and sanction movement, all of them were part of one coherent whole. It was a part of one unifying set of social justice attitudes. Anti-Semitism was not. Even though young evangelicals supported the Jewish people, expressed relatively high levels of concern about anti-Semitism that were on par with the older generations. In their minds, those two things were apart. So social justice with more domestically focused areas, with the exception of global warming, right, had a very distinct kind of set of subsequent attitudes than concerns about anti-Semitism. But what we have discovered is that anti-Semitism or concerns about anti-Semitism is an important driver of support, not only among evangelicals, but also among Catholics, as well as American Jews. So concerns about anti-Semitism prominently figures in why folks in the United States support Israel. And it is a very robust connection that spans different groups. I want to mention one additional thing that we haven't said yet, but I'm sure is on everyone's minds. And Yoav, you kind of hinted at that at the beginning. We're looking at a very, very small time period. We're looking at 2 data points. So there's still quite a lot of uncertainty of where we are headed. And so one potential is that these young evangelicals of the current age, they grew up with a more critical media environment. They've developed attitudes that are not particularly pro-Israel. And those attitudes are now crystallized, and just like the generational cohort that lived through the Great Depression and then forever loved public works, these young evangelicals with their sort of less than supportive attitudes of Israel will continue to be not particularly supportive of Israel through the remainder of their lifetime. But yet there's another possibility, and that is as they grow older, so-called life cycle theory, that they will become more conservative, both politically and religiously, sort of adopting the same premillennial and pro-Israel kind of theological thought as their parents and grandparents, and will become more supportive of Israel in the older age. So it's a really interesting kind of dynamic that we continue to watch, and we certainly are actually right now in the process of preparing a survey in the evangelical community to better understand how these changes are happening now, and what sorts of new things we can discover in the post-Gaza, post October 7th era.
Right. So, all right. So, thanks. So, I want to get into specific questions, and then I'll take some of the audience, because I have a half dozen questions already, including about the Gaza war. But there's two specific things, one for Diane and one for Daniel, that you both mentioned that I really want to flush out. The first is I think it's about culture, right? Because, right, Kirill, you just said that we don't know what's going to happen down the road to this generation. Maybe in 10 years they become more conservative, and they grow up like their parents and grandparents, and there's no need to worry from Israel's perspective, at least. But this is a question of socialization, right? And how do values get passed down through generation to generation? And here I do want to ask Diane and Daniel about culture, about popular culture, evangelical culture, because one of the most profound things that we know about the Billy Graham, Jerry Falwell generation, is that the use of popular culture was so influential, right? And we're thinking about, and this was mentioned already, but I'm thinking about the bestsellers, the pop apocalyptic fiction of the late great Planet Earth, the Hal Lindsey book. These are mega bestsellers. The film His Land, right, which I think Daniel wrote a wonderful article about that a few years ago, right? These are really significant cultural events that help reproduce these values and instill them, right? And we see that in music, people like Johnny Cash, right, like Pat Boone. So that's that generation in the 70s and the 80s, even in the 90s, the Left Behind series. What about now? If we're thinking about pop culture in the last 10, 20 years, especially for the under 30 generation, and Diane and Daniel, I'd be happy if you could maybe try to analyze this. Then, do we see these values being reproduced, or do we see Israel play a very different role, or maybe just not play any role? And that in and of itself is quite significant if we're thinking about evangelical culture.
I can give it a shot first and say, yeah, we definitely see on the popular level a continuing resonance of some of these themes. I think if you go onto Amazon right now and you pull up the Eschatology bestseller list, there's a number of books that are on there all the time, and they're by authors like David Jeremiah, Joel Rosenberg, Amir Tsafarti. These are you could say pop dispensationalist type authors who continue to write about the rapture, about what's happening in the world that's fitting into prophecy. We saw after October 7th a number of large church pastors, mega church pastors, the next Sunday weigh in, whether that's Robert Jeffress down in Texas or Greg Laurie in Southern California, weigh in with sermon series that were putting everything in prophetic context for their audiences. So I think on that level, there still is a persistent pop dispensationalist flavor to evangelical culture. I'm not sure how appealing that culture is to younger evangelicals. It feels, and I'm the historian, so I might just be projecting, but it feels like it's more of a Gen X boomer type audience, again, like we talked about before. The other thing I'll say is on a less popular front, on the seminary front, this is where a lot of the polling is really interesting around pastors and what their eschatological and other views are. There, I think you've seen a big sea change that does not mirror necessarily the popular. And the decline of particularly dispensationalism, but even premillennialism as the dominant way of teaching seminarians about the Bible, about theology, has been pretty pronounced in the last, you could say, 50 years. And that filters into who are people's pastors and what books are, being written by scholars. And the change has been toward a more amillennial, frame, or a very premillennial frame that drops a lot of the distinctive views that would lead you to support Israel on theological grounds. And there are still very large dispensationalist seminaries. Dallas Theological Seminary is one. The Divinity School at Liberty University is another one. But there's also another class of seminaries that have actually switched or left the dispensationalist fold in the last generation. And so they're training, hundreds, thousands of pastors who do not have the same built-in theology, and then they're giving sermons every week that don't have that same built-in theology. So that's another way to track this. I think it's a mixed, you could say it's a mixed landscape, but there still certainly is some prevalence of the same themes that even you'd recognize if you just read Hal Lindsey's Late Great Planet Earth, and then you look today, there's still a continuity in how many evangelicals talk about the Middle East.
Diane, you want to respond?
Yeah, well, when I look at popular culture, generally, I see a lot of poking fun at evangelicals, and pointing out their hypocrisy. And I'm thinking of the righteous gemstones. I'm thinking about Black Santa, Black Jesus. I'm thinking about Greenleaf. All those shows show the hypocrisy of the evangelical community, and that's these are somewhat niche shows, but they can be cultural influencers. And the very fact that there is an audience for shows that poke fun at evangelicals, seems to me to be significant in this area. I think for many, maybe bi-coastal Americans, white evangelicals are sort of the punchline to, a cultural joke. Like, it's not so funny, but what's happening to our country? Who do we blame some recent events on? And I do believe that idea is becoming more widespread. And I think it feeds the resentment of very conservative white evangelicals, knowing that elite media looks at them as both destroyers of freedom, but also as cultural buffoons. So I think that in popular culture, white evangelicals in particular, but some of the shows I mentioned also were about Black evangelicals, are not seen as tremendously righteous characters. I think also that in another vein of popular media, which young people see, there have been a number of documentaries about Israel and its connections to American evangelicals that have been painted evangelicals in a pretty bad light. And I'm thinking of Till Kingdom Comes, and I believe there's one or two others. The new film Israelism isn't about evangelicals, but it is something which is circulating and also shows Israel in a not so favorable light. So I think there are strong signs in popular culture that A, Israel is not the good guy anymore, and B, neither are white evangelicals.
Moti, did you want to respond to that?
Not that, to something different that was mentioned earlier, the decline of premillennial dispensationalism. And I want to one quick comment about that. So the idea behind premillennial dispensationalism is that the second coming is an event that's going to take place in the near future, and they got a lot of boost for those ideas because of the 6-day war and Israel takeover of the West Bank and Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, and all of that. But now 50 years have passed since then, and you can't say Jesus is coming for 50 years and he's not coming, and eventually people start believing that's going to happen. So there's, at some point, it creates an effect that, okay, maybe this is not happening as all the signs have shown, a few years ago.
All right. Kirill, yeah, you wanted to jump in?
So earlier, there was this tension between descriptions of premillennialism by Diane and Daniel. And I think that that tension in part highlights the differences in terms of human agency and how much human agency is ascribed in different versions of premillennialism. Premillennialism at its essence and its kind of traditional, Darby version is very passive, right? Kind of sit back, it's going to get worse, it's going to get really, really bad. And then, all of these specific events begin to happen, right? But you cannot affect the pace at which the end times will arrive, right? Whereas the current dispensationalism in particular is much more proactive. It's almost post-millennial in its desire to hasten the end times, right? So it infuses human agency into eschatology that didn't necessarily have that from the start. And something else that Dan said, I want to briefly, just very briefly comment on. One of the most fascinating things for me was, the survey with 1,000 pastors that we did for the book, and the degree to which eschatology doesn't just matter less to the parishioners, it matters less to pastors. They are studying it less. They're focusing less on that. And one of the things that we find is that unless you take a look only at the pastors who are like intensely devoted to particular eschatology, the effects of eschatology are not statistically significant. So only at that highest level of intensity, the strongest level of belief, does it begin to matter. So we're talking about a relatively small proportion of the pastor community that really feels genuinely strongly about, preaching about the end times and about making that a regular part of what they do with the parishioners.
Right. So I want to get in a few questions from the audience in the remaining 20 minutes. And here I'm condensing a lot of questions into a few questions because we got about a dozen. And I'll just throw this out to the group, and anyone who wants to take it up, just you can respond. And I think so. Maybe the most timely question is the Gaza war, and of course, just in terms of data, obviously you haven't had time yet to go into the field and do this, and this would be a speculative question. But how, and this is for everyone. Looking at what just happened in the past 4 months, and looking at the response of evangelicals in general, but younger evangelicals and younger Americans to what has been going on. What does that teach us? Have you been surprised, or is it a teachable moment in terms of where young evangelicals in Israel are going? Yeah, Diane?
Fortunately, we had a chaplaincy conference here at USC recently, so I was able to ask a number of chaplains about this. The response I've heard was that young evangelicals on campuses were extremely confused and overwhelmed and struck by the complications of this issue. And because of their feelings, maybe conflicting feelings about Israel and about the desire for social justice and the rights of people of color, many of them decided to do nothing at all because they didn't want to offend anybody. And they felt sympathy for both sides, but many chaplains reported that students didn't rush to join demonstrations because they felt the issue was so complicated and so confusing. They just decided to opt out.
And that I think is one of the main things we already see in Moti and Kirill's book, that the moving into the neither, right? That the not taking sides in that sense. Did others who want to take up this question about the Gaza war?
Sure, I'll take this one. This is, again, a little bit speculative and a little bit of a preview of the second book. We actually conducted a survey with Moti, with evangelical Christians, after the May 2021 Gaza war. And the intent there was explicitly to measure change in opinions. And what we saw is that the conflict with the Palestinians led to less pro-Israel attitudes in all age groups, but it was particularly pronounced in under 30s. So that group was most sensitive to recent fighting. And so my hypothesis would be that we would discover similar results with the last year's events in October.
Daniel, do you want to take this?
No, I as a historian, I really don't want to weigh on the last 4 months too much. But I'll just affirm, as someone who I work at a organization here at UW-Madison that serves students. What Diane said about the confusion and then the paralysis that leads from that is by far the the most common response. For many, for many 18-year-old, 20-year-olds, they haven't thought deeply about these issues before now, and so then they fall back on family advice, theological frameworks that they've inherited. And then, as Diane described before, a much, a complex media environment that's giving them a much different message maybe than even their inherited theology does. And I think that leads to a fear. And there's also a lot of tension on campus as well. So that it can be costly in a social way of taking a stand on this issue. And if this isn't one of your core issues that you have cultivated, it's going to be much, you're going to be more likely to pick that neutral category than either side.
Right. So it is really important, I think, to emphasize that the point of this so-called neutrality or confusion is so profound in terms of how it translates into politics and advocacy, because what it does is that it doesn't, right? And that, I think, is what's so important, because if we're thinking about the wider context of U.S. Israel relations, and domestic American politics in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, what was so important about the evangelicals, I think, wasn't just the numbers or the dominant role in the GOP. It's the passion, it's the enthusiasm. And I think anyone who's ever been to the John Hagee events or Falwell, and I was fortunate to attend all of those. I mean, it's amazing. It's electric, the energy in the room. And that then translates into lobbying, into writing Congress, right, into fundraising. If this generation is kind of neutral, apathetic, confused, they're not. It doesn't mean they're anti-Israel, but it means that when Israel might need them, they're not going to mobilize the way their parents and certainly grandparents. And that, I think, is what's so significant. All right. So a couple of more questions. Let's try to get in. So one is a very interesting question about the historical aspects. And here are a few questions. I'm condensing them. Is the fact that we're moving away from the Cold War, right, in terms of maybe the eschatological aspect. So the fact that we're moving away from the Cold War on one hand, and moving away from the Holocaust, which of course was so important for mainline Protestantism in the 40s and 50s as a source of humanitarian concern for Jews. Is that maybe part of the answer to what is going on? And yeah, anyone.
This is a really fascinating and very interesting question. And so there's a couple of different ways to think about it. We have informational environment in the United States that broadly impacts everyone, but it's filtered through individual beliefs, which then generate emotional responses and certain action tendencies, like you mentioned, Yoav, to write a congressman, to provide financial support, whatever the case might be. And so one of the most recent works that we're doing and we're working on is we're comparing Catholic, American Jewish, and evangelical attitudes on the issue of support for Israel in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. And what we find is that these generational effects are only present in the evangelical community. After accounting for theological, political, sociological reasons of potential support for Israel, age is only important in the evangelical model. And so that is really fascinating, and we're still, in very preliminary stages of exploring it, but it seems that these generational effects are most prominently found in the evangelical and born-again community.
If I can just jump in to say one more sentence, is that my research on what's happening among evangelicals led me to understand that someone called it a evangelical intifada, if we put it in the Israeli context, yes. So, but this is not just about Israel. It's not like young evangelicals are just the same like their parents, only with one exception, Israel. No, they are very different from their parents in many, many ways. So we have to understand that this is a generational issue that is happening among evangelicals on many subjects and many issues. Israel is just one of a much larger picture.
But maybe it's that point exactly that, especially after the Cold War, the whole geopolitical impetus to kind of be involved in these things kind of has disappeared, and then they could refocus, as your study has found, in social justice, environmental causes, and domestic issues, right? So I appreciate those who wrote me about the Cold War, because that's a very fascinating question, I think. Diane, Daniel, do you want to jump into that?
Yeah, it's hard for me as someone on a college campus to think that most of my students even know what the Cold War was. So, at least from my personal observation, I don't think that the change is due to the end of the Cold War. I think it's due to circumstances in the US since Obama's election. Things that may have been percolating for quite a while, but issues of racial justice, issues of voter rights, issues of women's position in the society, issues of systemic racism. I think that these more recent issues have a lot more to do with changing young people's and young evangelical ideas about the Middle East than their reaction to the Cold War.
There's a book by Stephen Bullivant called Exverts, which is looking at the deconversion of mostly Christians in the last few decades. And he makes a pretty strong case that you can tie this trend to the Cold War ending. And particularly his argument is that the Cold War created an artificial bubble, you could say, in the US, where religion took on particular saliency because of the framing of the Cold War as a religious war. And that this did not happen in even Western Europe. And so the trends of secularization that we see in Europe in the 60s and 70s, it was delayed in the US until the 90s and 2000s. That's his argument. I think that would fit into some type of periodization that would say, if religious identity is something that changed in the 90s because there wasn't this overarching ideological framework, basically his argument is that it was really costly to be an atheist in the US until the 90s. Because if you were an atheist, then you were a suspected communist and you were un-American, essentially. So if that's the case, then I could see an argument saying that students now who have absolutely, as Diane said, no framework of the Cold War, grew up in an environment where there was a different cultural expectation around religion and therefore a different way of reasoning your religion toward a politics that is just way different than people who grew up in the 60s, 70s, or 80s would have, because they had a different framework where these issues were more tightly bound around religious identity, and they no longer are.
And to add to that, I think there is much more compartmentalization of media, and you can sort of find what kind of media you want to consume now in a way that you simply could not do during the Cold War. And so I think that also adds this whole echo chamber effect that really adds to the changes that we see in a variety of different communities.
So I'll try to get in one or two final questions. We have half dozen questions, all of them about Islam and the changing views towards Muslims and Arabs among evangelicals. So I'll try to just condense this. Part of it is about the data, and part is just in general. So I think that it's a two-part question. First is, has there been some kind of have you detected in the data certain responses in terms of a new relationship with Muslims, kind of between younger evangelicals and Muslims, maybe on the more cosmopolitan university campuses, kind of a renaissance just in reintroducing a lot of younger evangelicals to Muslims, and that maybe is something that's changing the way they're thinking about them and generating more sympathy for the Palestinians. So that's the first part of that question. And then the second, and a few people asked about this, is what is the role of terrorism? Is it possible that the fact that 9/11 and the threat of this kind of Al-Qaeda and Muslim terrorism has somewhat waned since it's been over 20 years, maybe that's also part of the explanation?
Monty, do you want to go ahead, or do you want me to start?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Kerry.
Okay. So in our 2018 survey, we actually asked respondents to tell us why they supported Israel, gave them, religious as well as geopolitical and security types of answers to really make them think about different reasons why they support Israel. And we found that geopolitical and security reasons were not statistically significant predictors of support for Israel, that it was more religious and theological explanations that played a role in 2018. I think that the opinion of Muslims and attitudes towards Islam are heavily conditioned by 9/11 and what happens in the United States afterwards with the war against terrorism. So from that perspective, I think the fact that young evangelicals in 2021 are more favorably predisposed towards Muslims suggests the waning effects of that post 9/11 era. That sort of fervor that connected all of the security-related problems and terrorism explicitly and specifically to Muslims, at least in the minds of young people, is receding in the background. 9/11 for them was an event that happened before, many of them even reached an age where they could think, analytically about that event and how it impacts their lives and their opinions. So I think that also plays a major role in the difference that we observe in the opinion of Muslims between young evangelicals and older evangelicals. But there's another really important thing to mention, and that is, again, informational environment matters. When we conducted our survey in 2018, it was 4 months after Trump announced that he is moving the embassy to Jerusalem and that he will consider Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel. And he explicitly says, this is for evangelicals. The Palestinian response that was broadcast on the news was rocket attacks by Hamas and other militant groups, right? So you have an effect on our sample, right, that we cannot account for directly, but it's certainly present. There is a more positive perception of things related to Israel, and there's a negative kind of baggage related to the Palestinians at the time that our sample is exposed to the survey. And so I think it's important, again, to highlight this fact that information and environment matters greatly, and we again and again find it in our data.
Yeah, I just want to add to Kirill is that what we saw in our first survey is that socialization was an important factor in developing pro-Israel approaches, meaning that if you hear other people talk about how beautiful Israel is, it makes you more supportive of Israel. And then in 2021, we saw with the young evangelical a counter-reaction, which is they reported that the more they hear about Israel, the more they become against Israel. They're sick and tired of it. They don't want to listen to that. Enough with that. So this is part of the evangelical intifada that is happening, yes, that they are countering their parents. And so it may be their views about Muslims. So because their parents and their grandparents are not so much fans of Muslims, and it is a fact, maybe the young generation is doing the opposite, just like with views of Israel. I just want to say one more thing. When we ask people in America, why do you support Israel over the Palestinians, and we give them an open-end box that they can type an answer, we see a lot of times that they narrate their views as anti the other. So they support Israel because the Palestinians are terrorists. This is a very common answer that you see why they support Israel. You don't see the other way around. Maybe you do. But yeah, but there's the sense that you support one side of the group because the other side is violent and terrorist and aggressor. So this is something also that this is the psychology behind why you support this side over the other.
Daniel,
yeah.
final thoughts? Yeah, please.
I have a quick question for Moti and Kirill. Speaking specifically of young evangelicals on campuses now, do you think their changing attitudes have to do with their changing attitudes about the Gaza war have more to do with Muslims or with sympathy for Palestinians as victims of injustice? I mean, I don't know if being Muslim is really the central issue for young people, whether they're evangelical or not. It's more about the Palestinians as an oppressed people of color.
I would tend to agree with that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Moti. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just want to say something, but I don't want to speculate. We are going to do a survey and it's going to happen soon. And then we'll be much more knowledgeable about, how people responded to this. Because there was also an attack of Palestinians on Israel. So who's the victim here? I'm not sure, we'll have to test and see.
But
know a lot
it is
of-
undeniable that people respond to emotionally laden information, right? And visuals have not been particularly positive for Israel, right? All of the destruction that's presented in Gaza creates an emotional response. And those emotional responses are certainly guiding the way that young people are thinking about everything that's happening now. And so that is another big contrast between Cold War era and now, is that this emotionally laden visual information is so much more present today. And the asymmetry in power is very clear. In the Cold War, the asymmetry was between the proverbial David, Israel fighting against the proverbial Goliath, the Arab states supported by Soviet Union. Now the power asymmetry is the other way, and it's, the images are very poignant in that regard, I think.
Right, but I think that young people looking at those images are not thinking, oh, those poor Muslims who are being killed in Gaza. They're
No.
thinking, oh, those poor Palestinians.
Yes.
Daniel, final thoughts? Yeah.
Sure. Well, I was just going to observe that here at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm sure many other places, there is a concern about Islamophobia on campus that is often framed as opposing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia at the same time. Now, what is meant by Islamophobia is probably contextual and local, and it could include criticism of Palestinians, which might not technically be Islamophobic. But anyway, just to note that on the administration level, at least, there is this framing in a religious, semi-religious context of what's going on.
All right. So I think on that note, we're right on time. I apologize if I didn't get to your question, but I want to thank all the audiences in Israel, in the U.S., abroad. I certainly want to thank again all our wonderful participants, Moti and Kirill and Diane and Daniel. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insight. I think if we've learned a lot of things, but one conclusion I think that people have to understand is that support among evangelicals for Israel is not deterministic. It is not something that had to happen. It was constructed. It was very contingent. And therefore, Israel cannot take this for granted. And this is something I've been telling a lot of policymakers here. And we'll conclude with that. I'll just say we have a third webinar scheduled for the spring, right? And about this topic, and we will certainly publicize it when we have more information. You could view this event on YouTube. Just follow the Center for the Study of the United States at Tel Aviv University. We have a YouTube channel and our website, and you could see all this stuff. And please follow us. And I want to thank everyone again and wish everyone a wonderful evening or a wonderful rest of your day, wherever you are. Good night.
Thank you.